The men who came through Hazel Patch in November 1779 were already in trouble before the snow started. You could see it in how they moved. 60. Some people pushing through the gap, women carrying children, men dragging furniture on sleds that kept catching on roots, all of them looking at the sky the wrong way, watching it like it might negotiate with them. Like if they moved fast enough, December would hold off out of courtesy. Elias Cook had been watching them for 2 days by the time the first real flurry hit. He was 31 years old, enslaved, brought west from the North Carolina Piedmont by a land speculator named Thomas Whitfield, who had no more idea how to survive a Kentucky winter than he had any idea how to fly. Elias had been watching the ridgeline, watching the way the wind bent the bare hickory tops in a specific direction northeast, which in this part of the Appalachians in late November meant one thing, and it wasn't mild. He'd spent enough seasons in the high country to know the difference between a weather system that passes and one that settles in and decides to stay. The settlers were building their camp on the flat ground near a creek bend. Elias watched them do it and said nothing. Because in 1779, a black man in a party of white Kentucky settlers didn't get to say much of anything, especially when what he had to say was, "You're doing this wrong." So he watched them select the most dangerous possible location exposed to the northwest, on a flat that would catch and hold cold air as it drained off the ridges at night, watched them start cutting their half-faced camp poles along the creek bank where the soil was soft, watched them orient the open face directly into the direction the wind was going to come from. And he understood that when the storm arrived, and it was arriving, some of these people were going to get badly hurt. The winter of 1779 into 1780 is in the historical record as the hardest winter in North American memory. David Ludlum, who spent decades studying early American climate, called it flatly the coldest on record before or since. New York Harbor froze. The Chesapeake Bay froze. Soldiers at Morristown roasted their shoes and ate the leather because there was nothing else. In Kentucky, barely settled, barely mapped, surrounded by people who had every reason to want the settlers gone that winter, killed cattle in the fields, froze horses standing up, drove deer out of the hollows in herds, so desperate they walked through settlement clearings in broad daylight. The Kentucky River froze hard enough that Daniel Boone crossed it on Christmas Day with his whole family walking on the ice. The oldest settler in every community said they'd never seen anything like it. Elias Cook had not seen anything like it either. But he knew something the settlers didn't, and what he knew was going to matter in about 48 hours. I want to be honest about what this story is and what it isn't. The thing people imagine when they hear Black Mountain Men is usually Jim Beckwourth, the big, bold Rocky Mountain figure, trapping beaver on the Green River, riding with the Crow Nation, finding a mountain pass through the Sierra Nevada. And Beckwourth was real, born the 26th of April, 1798, in Frederick County, Virginia, in the shadow of the Blue Ridge, before his father moved the family out to Missouri when Jim was maybe 9 or 10. That story gets told. But the men who were actually living and working and surviving on the Appalachian frontier in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the black men who knew that country in a way the white settlers mostly didn't, those men are much less famous, and their stories are stranger and more complicated, and in some ways more worth knowing. Men like Jack Hart, who came through the Cumberland Gap with Daniel Boone's party in March 1775 and helped select the site of Fort Boonesborough himself. Men like Munca Still, who manufactured gunpowder from limestone cave saltpeter at a station in Madison County, and once carried a wounded militia captain 25 miles on his back to safety after a Wyandotte raid. Men like Derry Coburn, who was Daniel Boone's most constant hunting companion in the old explorer's final years in Missouri. These men knew the mountains in a different way than the settlers who arrived in wagon parties. They'd been working in this landscape for years, sometimes decades, before the waves of settlement came. They'd learned things, some from Cherokee hunters they traded with or ran alongside, some from Shawnee and Wyandotte knowledge that filtered through years of contact, some from their own hard-paid observation across many seasons in the high country. Elias Cook is a figure I'm building from the documented world of that era. a composite drawn from the real record of who was actually present in those parties, what those men knew, and what actually happened to people who did and didn't apply that knowledge in the winter of 1779 to 1780. The specific details of his life are reconstructed from the pattern of what is documented. His knowledge is real. His techniques are real. What he faced was real. What he did with all of it. That's the story. He was a tall man, Elias. 6'2", in a period when most men were closer to 5'8", with the kind of long-limbed build that looks angular at rest but covers ground fast. His hair had been cut close since he was a boy. Whitfield's preference, not his, but 3 months on the trail had changed that, and by November 1779, he wore it in tight, flat coils pressed against his skull, already developing the texture of wool that stays put in wind. His hands were the thing you noticed most. The knuckle on his right middle finger was permanently displaced, broken badly in a log-rolling accident at age 14, and never properly set, and the whole hand sat at a slight outward angle when he held a tool. It didn't affect his grip. It affected nothing, except the way it looked. People who worked alongside him for a season sometimes noticed it eventually. People who worked with him for a day never saw it at all because his hands were too busy. He'd come west with Whitfield from Rowan County in the North Carolina Piedmont, part of a land claim party following the Wilderness Road in the late spring of 1779. Whitfield had 3 things: a land warrant for 300 acres somewhere near the Kentucky River, a long rifle he couldn't shoot straight, and Elias, who could do almost everything Whitfield himself could not. Elias could read a map, though he'd learned this privately, at risk, from the surveyor's assistant who occasionally wintered with Whitfield's household. He could dress a deer in under 4 minutes. He knew which bark made the strongest rope, which roots were safe to eat in March when everything above ground was still dead, and most useful of all in November 1779. He understood the physics of cold in a way that most of the settlers on that trail simply did not. He'd gotten this knowledge piecemeal, the way you get most knowledge that actually sticks. Some of it came from a Cherokee trader named Oconaluftee John, who worked the mountain paths between North Carolina and what would become Tennessee, a man who'd been stopping at outlying stations and farms since before Elias could remember, and who would, on a slow morning, sometimes sit with whoever was willing to listen and talk about the high country in winter. Some came from a Shawnee man he'd encountered once during a lone hunting trip into the hills west of Rowan County, an encounter that could have gone several ways and went well, resulting in a shared fire, a shared meal, and a set of observations about sleeping shelter that Elias spent the next 3 years turning over in his head. Some of it he'd worked out himself, from nothing but seasons of close attention and a willingness to notice what actually kept him warm and what didn't. What he knew, assembled, and compressed. Cold is not a force that attacks you. It's an absence, and absences can be managed if you understand what you're managing. The settlers had their half-faced camp framed up by the second afternoon. 12 poles, roughly cut from creek bank sycamore, notched and crossed at the top to hold a ridgepole, the open face toward the creek and toward the northwest, which was the direction everything was going to come from. They'd covered 3 sides with bark and pine boughs. The 4th side was open, with a fire trench dug in front of it. The fire would push heat into the structure, they figured. That's how it was supposed to work. Elias stood 20 feet away, watching them finish the lashing on the ridgepole. The problems were layered. The location was wrong. That flat ground was a cold air sink, meaning the dense cold air sliding off the ridges at night would pool there the way water pools in a low spot. And the temperature at ground level would be 5, maybe 8 degrees colder than the slope 40 feet above them. The orientation was wrong. Open face into the wind meant the fire was going to push heat outward into the night, not into the shelter, and when the wind picked up, it was going to drive smoke back into the structure and make it unlivable. The floor was bare earth, which would pull heat out of anyone sleeping on it faster than the fire could put it back. And the bark on the walls had been laid flat against the poles with the smooth side out, which meant rain and melt would run straight through, and the inside of the structure would be wet inside of an hour, once the precipitation started. He didn't say any of this to Whitfield. He said, "I need to look for a better campsite." Whitfield said, "The camp's done." Elias said, "For horses." And Whitfield, who was worried about his horses because he'd paid for them himself, whereas Elias had been inherited, said, "Fine. Don't go far." He went about 300 yards up the slope, northeast, looking for what he knew he'd find if the ridgeline sat the way he thought it did. He found it in about 15 minutes. A south-facing bench in the hillside, maybe 40 feet wide and 20 deep, backed by a limestone outcrop that jutted out over the top of the bench, like an incomplete roof. The overhang wasn't enough to shelter anything on its own. Maybe 4 feet of clearance, at the deepest point. But it was a start. And the bench faced south, which meant it caught the low winter sun from roughly 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, which in a Kentucky January is 6 hours of solar heat, landing directly on your sleeping surface and your walls. The limestone at the back would absorb that heat through the day and radiate it back at night. The outcrop would block the snow from directly above. The rock face on either side curved slightly inward, natural windbreak. He stood on that bench for a few minutes, looked at the tree line, figured the wind paths, looked at the sky, which by now had the particular flat gray that means snow before morning. Then he went back down the hill and, carefully, told Whitfield he'd found a better place for the horses. They moved the horses that afternoon. Whitfield didn't ask about the rest of the party. That was a problem Elias couldn't solve directly, so he solved it sideways. There was a woman in the party named Hannah Carver, widow, 42 years old, traveling with 2 children under 10, who had struck him as someone who paid attention. He found her near the fire that evening, getting the children's supper ready, and he told her, quietly, that the bench up the hill was a better place to be when the storm hit. He didn't explain all of it. He said, "That spot's sheltered. It'll be maybe 10 degrees warmer than here, and the snow won't reach it the same way." Hannah Carver looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "How do you know?" He said, "I've been watching weather in these mountains for 6 years." She thought about that. Then she said, "What would we do up there? There's no shelter." He said, "I'll build one. Give me tonight and tomorrow morning." Here's what he built. And I'm going to walk through this slowly because the details matter, and most people, if they've thought about it at all, have thought about it wrong. The standard settler half-faced camp was built for function at the expense of physics. You put up poles, you covered the sides, you lit a fire in front of the opening, and you hoped it worked tolerably in October. In December, in a real mountain storm, it was frequently not enough. What Elias built on that bench drew from 2 traditions that the settlers had no access to: the Cherokee winter house technique that Okanalufty John had described to him across several winters, and the insulation logic he'd worked out from the Shawnee man's teaching and his own observation. The result wasn't identical to either source. It was his synthesis, built from what he had available, on a specific hillside, in a specific storm window, for specific people. The frame went up against the limestone face. He cut 6 poles from the nearest stand of young chestnuts. Chestnut was what you used when you needed something that wouldn't rot under wet bark and could be cut fast without splitting, and he angled them from the rock, face outward and downward at roughly 45 degrees, which created a pitched roof that the snow would shed rather than pile on. 4 feet of clearance at the back, 6 feet at the front opening. He lashed the poles with strips of inner basswood bark soaked in the creek for an hour to make them pliable. The covering was what mattered. He didn't use flat bark laid smooth side out the way the settlers had done their camp. He used tulip poplar bark, big sheets of it, peeled in November when the bark separates, cleanly laid rough side out in overlapping courses from the bottom up, exactly like shingles on a roof, each course lapping 2 inches over the one below it. Rough side out meant the water and melt followed the texture downward instead of sheeting through. The Cherokee women who built the Assai, the winter lodges that colonial surveyor John de Bram had described 30 years earlier as so warm that European visitors couldn't stay in them for more than a few minutes, used bark. in exactly this overlapping pattern. Elias had never seen an ASI built. He'd had it described to him by a man who had. The principle stuck. The floor was the part that most settlers never thought about. Cold ground in a Kentucky December is not just uncomfortable. It will kill you over time, not dramatically, but steadily, pulling the heat out of whoever is lying on it faster than any fire can replace it. The earth itself has more thermal mass than a human body, and if you put a sleeping human directly on it, the ground wins. The Cherokee sleeping platforms in the winter house were raised off the ground for exactly this reason. Cane frames covered with bearskin, high enough, James Adair wrote, that fleas couldn't reach the sleepers in a single jump, which also meant they were well above the cold air layer at floor level. Elias didn't have bearskin or cane. He had the hillside. He cut a 4-inch layer of dry leaves from under a nearby grove of oaks. Dry oak leaves, specifically, because they stay fluffed and trap air between them rather than matting flat the way maple or poplar leaves do, and he laid that over the bench floor, then cut small branches of pine and laid those over the leaves, needles up, to keep the leaf bed from compressing under body weight. The result was about 5 inches of dead air space insulation between anyone sleeping there and the ground. The walls on the two sides, the open portions, not covered by the limestone, he filled in with pine boughs, stacked 3 feet thick, stacked upright, butt ends down, with the needles toward the outside, dense enough that your hand sinking into the wall from inside couldn't reach the outer surface. The same principle as a buffalo robe or a heavy wool blanket. The insulation isn't in the material itself. It's in the still air trapped between the fibers, or between the needles. Air that doesn't move, doesn't carry heat away. At the front, the open face, he built a small fire, but not the roaring settler fire aimed at heating open air. He built what the mountain country hunters called a reflector arrangement. 2 green logs on either side of the fire, parallel to each other, close enough that the fire between them had to push its heat in 2 directions outward toward the shelter opening, or up. He cut a 4th log and stood it at an angle behind the fire as a backstop, which reflected heat forward into the shelter instead of letting it escape. The fire itself he kept small. A large fire needs constant feeding and creates large temperature swings. A small, steady fire between reflectors will hold a shelter interior 10 to 15 degrees above the outdoor ambient temperature through a night without anyone having to wake up to feed it more than once. He was done by early afternoon the following day. Hannah Carver came up the hill with her 2 children and 3 other women who'd decided to follow her lead. They looked at what he'd built, and none of them said anything for a moment. Then one of the women, he didn't know her name, a young woman with a torn hem on her dress and a look of permanent exhaustion that seemed older than she was, said, "It doesn't look like much," Elias said. "It'll hold," she said. "The camp down there has a real fire," he said. "Come morning you'll know which one was warmer." The snow started around 2 in the morning. He knew it started then because he was awake when it started. Lying at the outer edge of the shelter with his blanket pulled up and listening to the sound change from wind in dry branches to wind in snow, a different sound, softer and more constant, like someone sanding a very large piece of wood a long way off. He lay there for a while and watched the flakes come through the gap at the shelter front and vanish into the fire's heat zone before they hit the ground. He watched the fire and felt the temperature inside the shelter and judged that everything was holding the way it should. Down the hill, he could hear the settler camp, could hear the fire there too, a loud cracking fire that someone had built up high because the cold was getting serious. Could hear a man coughing in the smoke that the wind had backed into the open face of the half-faced camp. He added 1 piece of wood to his reflector fire, lay back down, slept. By morning 6 inches had fallen, still falling, wind picking up from the northwest exactly as he'd expected. The tulip poplar bark on the shelter roof had a 2-inch cap of snow on it that was sliding off at the edges as he watched. Inside, the leaf and pine floor had lost maybe a degree of warmth overnight. The air temperature inside the shelter was, and I'm working from, what a structure of these specifications would produce at ambient temperatures of around 18 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what the record suggests for that morning, probably 32 to 34 degrees, cold enough to see your breath, but warm enough that no one was in danger. He climbed out and looked down the hill. The settler camp was a mess. The fire had burned down in the night, and the wind had driven snow straight into the open face of the half-faced camp, and 3 families had slept with snow blowing across them for several hours. A horse, not one of Whitfield's, had gotten loose and frozen its feet in a low spot by the creek. One of the older men in the party was sitting near the ash-cold fire pit wrapped in everything he owned, his face the color of old candle wax, shaking in a way that wasn't going to stop on its own. Thomas Whitfield was standing in the middle of it, looking at his land warrant as though reading the description of the 300 acres would solve the immediate problem. Elias went down and started a proper fire, using a technique the settlers never used. A platform of green logs first, to keep the burning wood off the wet ground, then a tiered structure of kindling that caught in one strike of flint and steel and produced steady heat within 4 minutes. He got the old man warm. He helped move the damaged horse. He looked at the camp and understood that the fundamental problem, the location, couldn't be fixed now. The snow was too heavy. Moving everyone up the hill in this weather would be its own risk. So he told Whitfield they needed to bank the open face of the half-faced camp with snow. Whitfield looked at him like he'd said something in a foreign language. Elias said, "Pack the snow against the outer wall, 3 feet thick, all the way around the 3 closed sides and halfway up the open face." Whitfield said, "That'll make it colder." And this is the thing that I keep coming back to, the thing that makes this whole story strange and worth telling. The settlers weren't stupid. Whitfield wasn't a stupid man. He'd made a reasonable investment in Western land, organized a party, led it through 200 miles of wilderness. He was capable, but he had a gap in his understanding, a specific technical gap that no amount of general intelligence could bridge. He'd never been taught that packed snow is one of the best insulating materials in the natural world, that Inuit builders had been using it for centuries to construct shelters that held 40 degrees above ambient temperature inside when it was 30 below outside. That 2 feet of packed snow has an R value of roughly 10 to 15, which is comparable to several inches of modern fiberglass batting. That snowbanks against a half-faced camp don't make it colder. They seal the perimeter and stop the wind infiltration that was driving the temperature inside down by 12-15 degrees below what the fire could recover. Elias didn't explain all of this. He said, "The snow stops the wind from coming through the walls. The fire stays in. Try one wall. See what happens in an hour." Whitfield tried one wall. In an hour, 1 hour, the temperature on that side of the camp was noticeably different. The men working near that wall said so, out loud, surprised. They banked the rest of the camp within 2 hours. The storm lasted 4 days. 4 days of the kind of weather that the winter of 1779 to 1780 is documented as producing. Temperatures dropped below 0 by the second night. The creek froze, solid enough to walk on by the morning of the 3rd day. 3 of the party's horses died, 2 of them from cold in the low ground, and 1 from something else, maybe colic, maybe a prior injury. An older woman in the party, a Mrs. Dunbar, developed what looked like the early stages of frostbite in 2 toes on her right foot. She'd been sleeping in the settler camp's half-faced structure, not the one up the hill. Hannah Carver's group lost nobody and lost nothing. On the morning of the 4th day, when the snow stopped and the sky came out bright and white, and the temperature was somewhere around 6 degrees Fahrenheit, Elias walked the whole camp and took stock. He did something else that day that I think is worth talking about, because it's easy to tell a story about survival techniques and make it sound clean and systematic, like there was a plan and the plan worked and here's what we learned. Real survival in that period wasn't like that. It was constant improvisation under conditions that kept changing. What Elias did on the 4th morning was assess the food situation and realize that the storm had another immediate problem attached to it. The hunting was effectively over for the near term. Animals had gone deep into cover or died. The trail ahead was under several feet of snow. The party's stored provisions, mainly dried corn, some salted pork, a small quantity of dried beans, were going to run short if they stayed on the trail. He took that problem to Whitfield, and this time Whitfield listened, because the snowbanking had worked, and Whitfield was a man capable of updating his position when evidence required it. What Elias told him, there was a Cherokee winter village, what the settlers called a town, about 9 miles southwest, down off the ridge, and into a sheltered river valley. He'd seen the smoke from it 2 days before the storm hit. The town would have food stores. The question was whether the relationship between this party and the Cherokee was good enough to trade, and that was a question about Whitfield's land warrant and where those 300 acres were going to end up. It was a delicate problem, and Whitfield knew it. The Cherokee towns along the lower Kentucky and Cumberland rivers were not uniformly hostile to white settlers, but they were not uniformly friendly either. And the difference between those two things was in large part a function of whether the settlers had done something recently to make them angry. Whitfield's party they'd come through fast and hadn't burned anything or taken anything, but hadn't done anything bad lately, is a pretty thin diplomatic basis for showing up at someone's winter food stores and asking to trade. Elias said, "I speak some Cherokee. Not much. Enough." This is another thing that doesn't get talked about often enough. The black men who worked the Appalachian frontier in this era, enslaved and sometimes free, often had a linguistic range that their white counterparts didn't. Partly this was necessity. They moved between worlds more than most settlers did, sometimes running errands, or hunting alone at distances where knowing what a group of passing hunters was saying could be the difference between a normal day and a very bad one. Partly it was the specific circumstance of the Appalachian border country where Cherokee traders came through regularly, and the practical vocabulary of trade and weather and direction was learnable over time if you were paying attention. Elias had been paying attention since he was maybe 16, picking up words from Okanalufty John and from 2 or 3 other Cherokee men he'd had sustained contact with. He had maybe 150 words. That sounds like not much. In a winter trading situation where you wanted to convey, "We have salt, we need corn, we are traveling peacefully, we won't stay," 150 words is almost enough. Whitfield asked if he should come. Elias thought about that for a moment and said, "No." He walked the 9 miles through the snow in about 4 hours. The snow was knee-deep in the open and waist-deep in the drifts, and he moved along the edge of the tree line as much as possible because the snow was shallower there, packed under the canopy. He wore his normal clothing plus every additional layer he owned, which was not a lot, and he'd wrapped his feet in 3 layers of bark strips over his moccasins before he left a technique he'd figured out on his own after a winter of watching his feet get wet. The bark held water out for about 2 hours, which was enough. He found the Cherokee town in a river valley, exactly where he'd expected it. Maybe 30 structures, the large summer houses made of bark and split logs, sitting mostly empty in winter, and nested against them, the smaller, lower ASI structures that the community moved into in December, and stayed in until March. They were round or oval, built half into the ground, with walls of wattle and daub, 3 to 4 feet thick, and thatched conical roofs. You could stand next to one and put your palm on the outer wall and feel heat radiating through clay on a morning when it was 6 degrees outside. The interior Elias had been in an Aussie once before, briefly, in the mountains of North Carolina, an experience that had stuck with him because of the physical shock of walking into 35 degrees of ambient heat difference. The interior of a well-built ASI was so warm that men coming in from the cold had to take their outer garments off immediately, or they'd sweat through them. The fire in the center was small. The structure did the work. Every design choice, the excavated floor dropping 3 feet below grade, the thick walls holding the previous day's heat, the low door forcing you to crouch and lose less warm air, the sleeping platforms raised up off the cold floor was doing a job. It occurred to him that day, standing outside that structure, with his hands wrapped around a clay bowl of corn soup that one of the women had given him after the initial negotiation was done, that the settlers down in the valley had arrived in this country with tools and livestock and land warrants, and rifles, and not a single piece of this knowledge. They'd come loaded with everything except the understanding of where they actually were. The trade worked out. He brought back 40 pounds of dried corn and permission to come back in 7 days for more. He walked the 9 miles home in 3 hours because the return trail was already broken. There's a specific kind of knowledge that lives in landscape. I don't mean that in a mystical way. I mean it in a technical and very concrete way. The Cherokee people who had been in the southern Appalachians for many centuries had developed, through trial and error and intergenerational transmission, a body of building knowledge that was precisely matched to the specific conditions of that specific mountain system. The thermal mass of clay daub walls. The geometry of a dome that loses less heat per unit of enclosed volume than a box. The excavated floor that uses the Earth's constant 50 to 55 degree temperature as a floor-level heat source rather than a cold drain. The placement on a south-facing slope catching winter sun. The wood selection, seasoned hardwood that burns long, and even rather than softwood that flares and drops quickly. All of this had been refined over generations of trial and error in these specific mountains, at these specific elevations, in these specific winters. The settlers came from a European tradition that had its own building knowledge, genuinely good knowledge, in many contexts, but it had been refined for a different landscape. English cottages, German farmhouses, Scotch-Irish longhouses, they worked in a climate that was less extreme and more predictable than the southern Appalachian high country in a bad winter. The settlers weren't wrong to use what they knew. They were wrong to assume it was sufficient. What Elias Cook carried assembled from years of contact with Cherokee knowledge, from Shawnee teaching, from his own close attention, was a bridge. He couldn't build an Asai. He didn't have months, and a community of builders, and the specific materials prepared in advance, the way they were prepared in those Cherokee towns. What he could build in a night and a morning with hand tools and whatever the hillside offered was a structure that borrowed the key principles from that tradition and applied them to the materials at hand. He chose a south-facing bench, angled the roof to shed snow, laid the bark rough side out like shingles, insulated the floor, and built the reflector fire, 5 elements, each one doing a specific physical job, each one drawn from a tradition that the settlers, standing 20 feet away, had no access to. I think about what it cost him to have that knowledge and not be able to deploy it freely. To stand 40 feet from 60 people, some of whom were going to be hurt by the night, and to have to engineer a sideways path, convince Whitfield about the horses, convince Hannah Carver separately, deploy each piece of information through whatever avenue was available, because speaking plainly was either not permitted or not believed. He couldn't say, "I know how to do this better than you. Let me show you." He had to find other routes. The party came through the winter. Most of them. They reached the Kentucky River the second week of December, which was later than planned, and the river was already running ice. They crossed on a flat raft that Elias helped build. He'd talked Whitfield into using the ash plank construction technique rather than the green log raft the other men wanted. And the ash held together where the green logs would have pulled apart in the current, and they made the eastern bank of Whitfield's intended claim site on the 19th of December, 1779. They spent that winter at a small station about 4 miles from what would eventually become the town of Harrodsburg. 3 families, 2 single men, Whitfield and Elias. They lived through January 1780 and February 1780 and March 1780 months that are in the historical record as some of the most brutal cold that any European-descended settler in North America had experienced to that point. Elias built the winter shelter for the station. The settlers watched him build it, and this time, because they'd already seen what he'd built on the hillside hold through 4 days of blizzard, they didn't question the choices that puzzled them. They let him bank the walls with snow. They let him install the sleeping platforms off the floor. They let him build the reflector fire arrangement outside the door. They tried it, and it worked, and they remembered it. Within a generation, the log cabin was the dominant form again, partly because larger cabins with proper stone chimneys genuinely are warmer than any temporary shelter, and partly because the knowledge Elias brought was tied to him personally. It didn't get written down or systematically passed along. When he was gone, it mostly went with him, but not completely. Here's what I think actually happened in the decades after. The part that doesn't show up in any single account, but that I believe is true from the pattern of the evidence. The knowledge didn't vanish. It traveled. Unevenly, incompletely, through the specific channels available to it, women mostly, the ones who'd slept warm on that hillside and remembered exactly why. Hannah Carver, who spent the next 30 years in Kentucky, and who, her grandson's 1,841 account, says, was known throughout her community for a particular manner of building against winter that she'd learned from a man whose name I never got. That's the part that lands hardest for me when I sit with this. History. The knowledge traveled, the name didn't. Jack Hart's name is in the record barely. He's in the Kentucky Historical Society's collections, and the Kentucky Senate passed resolutions honoring him in 2004, and there's a replica of his rifle in the Explore KY History archive. But he's known as a scout and a marksman, not as someone who carried a tradition of building and survival knowledge through the Cumberland Gap. Monk Estel's manumission papers survive. His gunpowder knowledge, the saltpeter cave, the manufacturing process, the military value of it is in the record. But the shelter and winter survival knowledge that men like Elias Cook and others like him carried that's mostly gone, absorbed into the general Appalachian folk practice of the early 1800s, stripped of attribution. The rough side-out bark shingle shows up in Foxfire, the 1969 oral history of Appalachian building practice. The south-facing bench site selection shows up in early 19th century hunting manuals. The reflector fire arrangement shows up in American military field manuals by the 1840s. Pieces of a tradition that no single source attributes to anyone. I'm not claiming all of it came from Black Mountain men. That's not the argument. The argument is that Black Mountain men in the Appalachian frontier carried specific knowledge that mattered in specific moments, and the specific moments are documented even when the knowledge transmission isn't, and it's worth spending a few hours thinking carefully about who was actually there and what they knew, and what it cost them to know it in the conditions they were working in. Elias Cook, January 1780. 6 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. He's sitting outside his shelter on the bench, watching the sun go down behind the western ridge, and the light on the snow is the specific amber going to violet color that a Kentucky sunset produces in January when the air is genuinely cold, a color that only happens when the temperature drops below about 10 degrees and the moisture has frozen out of the atmosphere. And what's left is something almost painfully clear. He can hear the station below him, can hear the fire, can hear a child crying, which means the child is alive and warm enough to cry, which is good. He adds a piece of wood to his reflector fire. He watches the sparks rise and disappear into the cold air above them. He thinks about the Cherokee town 9 miles down the valley, all those Aussie structures breathing smoke into the clear sky, and about Okanalufty John, who taught him things over years of slow conversation, and about the Shawnee man, whose name he never knew, who showed him how still air holds heat. He thinks about what he's going to do in the spring, when Whitfield's land claim goes in, and a line gets drawn, and the question of what happens to Elias Cook becomes once again a question that other people answer. He doesn't have a solution for that yet. He has tonight. He has the fire. He has the bark walls, doing what bark walls do when you lay them right. The settlers who built on those first Kentucky stations between 1775 and 1785 were not failures. They were people attempting something genuinely difficult with incomplete knowledge in conditions that were worse than anyone had told them to expect. The record shows that. The survival rate shows that too. Most of them made it. Eventually, though the losses in the winter of 1779 to 1780 were real and documented. What the record also shows, if you look carefully, is that survival was not evenly distributed. The people who came through the worst winters were often the people who had access to a specific kind of knowledge about ground insulation, about snow banking, about south-facing sighting, about fire geometry, about the Cherokee and Shawnee building traditions that had evolved specifically for these mountains over centuries. And the people who had the most consistent access to that knowledge were often, for reasons that are not complicated to understand, the black men who'd been working in that landscape the longest and who'd had the most sustained contact with indigenous practice. That knowledge transfer was almost never clean or reciprocal or credited. It happened anyway. The floor of a well-built, half-faced camp on a south-facing Appalachian hillside in January 1780, with a reflector fire burning 3 feet from the opening, and bark walls laid rough side out in overlapping courses, and a thick leaf bed between the sleepers and the frozen ground. That floor was warm, not comfortable warm, survival warm, and the people lying on it didn't build it.